What makes someone remarkable? Do you mind being described as the white people whisperer? What is the optimal age to get married?
That year was the first year that we ever heard a teacher talk about race.
Is the college application process fair?
You start to find the non-obvious way kind of works.
Is there like a cartoonist community? So many times when we go live with these things, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Boom.
Welcome to the Non-Obvious Book Review. I am Rohit Bhargava, and today with me I have David Sax, who is a writer, reporter, author, speaker, and the author of the latest book, his latest book, The Future is Analog. How are you, my friend?
Rohit, wonderful. Great to be here. So nice to see your face in such high definition on your camera.
I did that just for you, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because we've been digital, right? And one of the things that you write in your book and what you talk about is that shift. But the first question I have to ask you is, what makes your book non-obvious?
I think it's contained in the title, right? Saying the future is analog is this declaration against the accepted wisdom that I'm really pushing against. I mean, that's the idea of the book. And it's that, for the past 40 odd years of the entirety of my life, the future of whatever it is was going to be digital. And to say, oh, the future of school is digital, the future of work is digital, the future of consulting is digital, the future of airplanes are digital. Say what you will and insert the word digital, and people will be like, yes, of course, that's accepted wisdom. So to say the future is analog really makes people question because it's an alternative reality, critical thinking about the future.
So you write that the technology worked, but at a tremendous cost to humanity. So let's start by talking about the cost. What is the cost of us spending so much time going digital?
There's a bunch of different costs. From a personal standpoint, you saw over the course of certainly growing over this past couple decades and accelerated during the pandemic when everything we did, work, school, culture, religion, family reunions, whatever you want to do, was done through a screen. We saw a rise of anxiety and aggravation. What was the term that everybody used to describe their lives? It was burnout. People were burnt out. And they weren't burnt out from baking sourdough, and they weren't burnt out from taking walks around the block. They were burnt out by an overdose of digital technology. They were burnt out by doing this, staring at a screen all day and shuffling between different screens. You have a Zoom meeting on your laptop, and then you're going to go watch Netflix to entertain yourself on your screen. And then you have a family reunion on your phone. And then you're going back to your laptop, and your kids are on their tablet. And they're, doing their elementary school homework on virtual school. And it was this cost to our sanity in a lot of ways and our sense of belonging. And I think the bigger societal cost is the cumulative effect of all that, of more and more people being, disembodied from their analog needs as human beings, from their bodies and the way it interacts in the world, from the world around them, from relationships and social situations and spaces like work and school and cities and the cultural spots like theaters, for example, that give us a sense of identity and grounding in the world. And we cut all that out and replaced it with this. And that really had, tremendous effects in almost every area of life. So we can go through them. But, what happened when you did this to schools and removed children and students and teachers from the physical building of school? The education world, the educational system pretty much collapsed. Learning, took a massive dive, as well as all the other things that came with that sense of community and being in a classroom, friendships, relationships, the sense of trust, the sense of safety, the desire, the motivation to learn facts and figures and these other things, right? What happened when you did this to people in offices? Some people did well, but a lot of people floundered. They grew stressed. We had, the great resignation before everyone started laying people off in the past few weeks, was the huge labor problem of the past couple of years. And much of it was fed by this sense of discontent that had traced its roots to, work being decoupled from a physical environment. And you could take it all the way to the extreme. What happened to our politics around the world as, the ability to have town halls, to meet face to face, all of that was disconnected and everything went online. It just, has devolved into a hellscape, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, it really has. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was how wide ranging you took your discussion of analog. I mean, you talk about schools, you talk about e-commerce, you talk about culture and the arts and all of those different things. And one of the places you chose to start with was schools, and how schools not only provide education for our kids, but they also form the center of our community in terms of the people that we actually get to interact with. And when you take that away, there's something very basic that gets missing. So talk a little bit about why you chose to start with that early on, and how that realization sort of came to you as you were writing about it.
The realization came to me on the first day after we were put into lockdown, and the school board emailed me and my wife and every other parent, and this happened to parents everywhere in the world except New Zealand. And they're like, hey, so here's how we're doing this. Your kid's going to get assignments emailed, and they'll have video calls with their teachers once a week, or however it works, right? Or they're going to be on video. It was in China. They're going to be on video the entire time. We're going to have sensor tracking technology to make sure they're in front of the screen, or whatever it is. This was all a lived experience that I went through. And I think for anyone who was a student, a teacher, a parent of any student of any age, it was a tremendously traumatic experience. People talk about this, in the way that they talk about other past traumas, wars. We had a, 2-day education strike this past week here in Toronto. And the notion, the suggestion that students were going to go back to virtual, and the school board said, hey, we might have to do this because of this education worker strike, and the government's pushing this contract down their throats. Be prepared. I mean, the fear that people had, the sort of text message chain of worry that was going on in the school community, was just an indication of the depth of that trauma. So I saw it. I lived through it. I had, a child in second grade and another kid in kindergarten, and it was the worst. The worst for their socialization, the worst for their behavior, the worst for their desire to learn and the amount they were learning and their comprehension of it, the worst for their friendships and the sense of fun, right? And this goes back to what you were saying at the beginning. School is not a place to learn facts and figures. That's a big part of it. And that's the reason you're ostensibly there. But what we realized is that school, which we've always known, read John Dewey, this is all he talks about. He doesn't talk about how to teach people math. He talks about how to make them citizens, right? School is a place where we are socialized into the world in a community of people through relationships. And it's through the building of those relationships and the cultivation of those relationships that we gain the motivation to learn math, science, art, drama, English, whatever you want to study, as well as learn how to behave and be a person, how not to be selfish, how to work cooperatively with other people, how to be creative, how to be empathic. All these things are a product of school. And I'm talking kindergarten and preschool, all the way to grad school.
Well, you say it's built into us as humans. At one point, you talk about the science behind this and how there's a certain chemical reaction that occurs when we're physically around people that just doesn't happen when we're interacting online.
Yeah, no offense to this conversation. We have evolved over the course of, 300,000 years as Homo sapiens, and, dumber apes previous to that. And we have evolved with our greatest skill, which is communication. It's not throwing spears, it's not running. It's this, right? And everything that this involves in a group of people. And the idea that we can then just take this and do this to it, move it onto a flat glass surface or put it into earphones, and it's the same thing, really misses out on the richness and complexity of the way that we communicate as human beings in person, face to face. And something like education is the perfect example of that, right? Because, in theory, and this has been something that's promised since there were books and encyclopedias that came out, since, Thomas Edison invented the radio and film, computers and CD-ROMs and the internet and streaming video classes online with one laptop per child and sort of the MOOC movement. The promise was that, hey, we have all this information. These teachers have to teach these subjects. There's a better, more efficient way to do that. We can put it in paper. We can put it on film. We can put it on audio. We can, give it to you in a CD-ROM. You can have it streaming to your device or wherever you are. And isn't that more efficient than the school? And no. And what they found is that even if people are listening to basically the same lecture by the same professor, like the number of people who will make it to the end of that lecture when it's online or recorded is a fractional percentage. It's 10% when they put the MOOC movement out there in the world, and they saw just how much it failed. And why is that? All sorts of reasons, right? All sorts of reasons. The social pressure of being in a place with other people listening to a teacher talk, and actually the pressure of being there is what gets you to listen. Even if it's boring, even if you're falling asleep, you still are there. You still have to listen. The physical cues, the timbre of someone's voice, the way they're walking about in front of the classroom, the sounds and the smells of the classroom, the entire sort of embodied cognition of that educational experience, all that goes into it. And all of a sudden, when it's in front of you on a screen or in your earphones, it's just information. And you're like, skip, let's listen to 1.5 speed. Let's listen on 2 speed. Do I really need this now? I'm gonna play video games in the other screen and check my emails and do these other things. And all of that is, again, flattens out the conversation, right? It's the confusion, which I think is central to the sense of dislocation we had, and central to the disconnect between analog and digital. It's the confusion between communication of information, which digital does incredibly well, and conversation, right? The communication of information is the sharing of data, text, images, sounds, some combination thereof, which you can do easier, quicker, cheaper, and a much greater scale with digital technology, right? Social media is the kind of pinnacle of this. But that is a very different thing from a conversation. And, when a teacher is teaching in front of a class, that's a conversation that they're having with those students. When some people are at work and they're at a all hands meeting of, 100 people or thousands of people at a conference, there's still an element of that conversation that's happening because there's energy there. There's interplay. There's a feel, and digital is very good at interdirectional one-way conversations.
Beyond education, one of the things that you focus on is cities. And I think that's such a fascinating place as well, because during the pandemic, a lot of people were predicting the death of cities. People were moving out of cities. We wondered if cities would even come back. But then you did a couple of interviews. You interviewed the editor of Monocle magazine. When you talked to Richard Florida, who's famous for writing about the rise of the creative class in cities. And one of the things that he said that you wrote about is what makes cities great is analog. And people came back to the cities, as we know now. Talk to me a little bit about what you found as you were doing the research around this and as you were writing. Did you always know that it was obvious and you were just like waiting for that shoe to drop and now you're like, all right, now I'll just write about it? Or was this kind of like a question mark in your process?
I don't think it was a question mark that the city would disappear or die. That was a ridiculous notion. Anyone who thought that is insane. And obviously, some downtowns are less busy than they were, and some areas are because of offices not returning, and some cities got so expensive that people had to move out. Places like Toronto, where I live. I, cashing in my white privilege card, moved up to my mother-in-law's lovely, luxury lakeside country house at the beginning of the pandemic to get more space for the children that were now home and doing school from the living room. And we spent 3 months up there, and this was a place we'd always gone on vacations and weekends. So there was something lovely about it, the fresh air, the space, all this stuff. But what was amazing was when we came back to the city in late May 2020 and back to our place in downtown Toronto was like the electricity of the energy of just stepping out our door and like seeing people and talking to people and watching people walk by and walking down the street. And even though stores were closed, you couldn't go into them. You know, there were cafes that had set up little windows and they'd done little cutouts so you can go get a coffee and a cookie. And, you know, there were places that had set up these like quasi-legal little patios, and the park in front of our house exploded with activity. You know, there would be a jazz band playing 2 times a week because they didn't have anywhere else to go, and just jamming. You would just sit on the grass and listen. One day I was walking through the park and someone was just playing Bach on a cello. There was all sorts of impromptu, interesting things that were created by this collision of human beings. And that's all a city is. It's a bunch of humans that live in one place. And the beauty and magic of them is like what happens when you get a bunch of people together, right? That's all New York is. That's all Paris is. That's all Tokyo and Nairobi and all these places are, right? It's a bunch of people together. Let's see what happens. And, you know, as anyone who's thrown a party or a conference or a wedding or whatever, it's like, honestly, you just got to get a bunch of people together and like magic will happen.
Cities have not always been designed that way. A whole part of the book where you talk about urban planning and Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs, and this story of how there were people who wanted to close off parts of the city, and that was something that others had to fight against. And the city itself was not always welcoming to this kind of analog lifestyle.
And this was the sort of reason I chose to write about it, because I think it is an exceptional example within the book. People are like, wait, cities? Like, how is that a digital or analog thing? But I think, you know, at the same time that this was happening, Google had this pilot project here in Toronto called Sidewalk Labs. It was part of, or Sidewalk Toronto, it was part of Sidewalk Labs, their sort of city building thing with Dan Doctoroff and other veterans of the Bloomberg administration. They were going to bring the magic of Google, big data, you know, robotics, analytics, all the best and bright things that we can do with computers. And they were going to use it to build the city of the future and use this part of downtown Toronto on the waterfront as this experimental neighborhood. And it was hailed by every level of government. It was, this is the future. And it was coming off the rails before the pandemic for reasons of privacy and money and all this sort of stuff. And the pandemic just, you know, put a bullet in it. This was this sort of competing vision of the future. This was like, the city can be this incredibly efficient place, and the city of the future is going to be using technology to make the city this incredible thing. And the sort of most extreme example you have of this is like Neom that's being built in the Saudi Arabian desert. So what are we talking about here? You said cities haven't always been this way. Cities always were this way, right up until the early middle of the 20th century, when the great minds of the world decided that progress was technology, and that technology was the automobile, that this was the future of humanity, and the city must make way for that. And that's everything that Robert Moses was about. All his ideas, all the destruction he did was like, the car is the technology that is the future. And this is progress, and we must build our world around it. And it wasn't just him. It was architects like Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, who had these visionary ideas of the city is dirty, the city is full of people, the city is full of vice, the city is chaotic and hectic and crowded, and we can build a brave new world. And all we have to do is use this technology to redesign this world. And so what do you get out of that? You get, I don't know, the fact that the world is burning and we're like completely screwed because we gave the world over to this technology, automobiles, that we said this is the future. And so what's the most interesting things that have happened in cities in the past, 50 years? It's all the cities that undid that took that idea of progress and said, wow, this is actually a terrible idea. It's terrible for people's safety. It's terrible for the social fabric, because suddenly you have cities where people can't even walk around. The neighborhoods aren't vibrant. People are living in their own houses. They can only drive places. Many American cities are like this. There's few American cities where you can just walk around and you can't even walk to get a cup of coffee. Let's undo this. And, initially you had Copenhagen and Amsterdam, which are cities that actually had lots of cars in them. They weren't always these bike paradises. And they started clawing it back, and they started making the cities open to pedestrians and bikers because they realized that the essence of a city, its magic, its economic dynamism, its potential, its attraction to tourists and residents was its cityness, not a convenient place. Not
You have some great examples in the book. You talk about the Samcheong Forest Library.
Yeah, this is something I happened upon when I was in Korea a couple years ago in Seoul. I was walking with my editors. We just wandered into this place. I was like, what the heck is this? He's, oh, this is the Forest Library. And imagine a park in the middle of a busy concrete city. And Seoul is one of the busier, more tech forward concrete cities in the world, right? Huge, sprawling, not a lot of trees. But there are these little mountains in Seoul, and they have these parks in them. And once you go in these parks, you're in the forest. There's, you know, birds and squirrels, and it's calm and the air is wonderful, and you can go hiking. It's beautiful. And in this library, an architect named Sojin Lee in this park built and designed this library. And she built this simple wooden building with big doors that opened onto the park right in front of the playground, windows that sort of were built with 5 feet deep window ledges that you could put a cushion in and sit and read and look out at the trees, with a little cafe in the middle that served coffee and cheesecake, and, you know, soft classical music played. And it was such a brilliant idea because it combined, you know, two of the most wonderful spaces that you find in any community, and certainly in cities, parks and libraries, as this kind of relaxing, grounding lung of civilized life in this modern, hectic metropolis. This is an idea that required any sort of radical technology. This isn't an idea that was, you know, needing all sorts of computers and the brightest minds, but it was an incredibly innovative idea. And the most innovative ideas we saw during the pandemic in cities weren't technological, weren't digital. It wasn't contact tracing apps and drones that would fly around and check for people's temperatures or some other such crap. It was like, hey, let's close down this street now that there's less traffic. We could have people bike and walk there on Saturdays and Sundays, and they'll get to enjoy life and be outside and not be together. Hey, we can't have people eating in restaurants. What can we do? Oh, I know. Why don't we take these parking spaces that are just like useless real estate for pieces of metal and turn them into patios?
The coexistence is really interesting. At one point, I know you write about like digital technology and e-commerce is often seen as the enemy of brick and mortar stores. And one of the questions that you pose in the book is, what if they could work together instead of it being either or this one or that one?
Yeah, I think, you know, we often get the idea wrong. And I think this is because digital works in the language of binary. It's a 1 or 0, it's on or off, it's Apple or Samsung, right?
Yeah.
That it is this sort of zero-sum game of digital or analog. And that's the way it was pitched. The office, you know, it has to be paperless. You know, school is going to be virtual. You know, how can we modernize this industry or this aspect of our life and do away with these other things? And the reality is that we want both, right? In an earlier book I wrote, The Revenge of Analog, you know, I talked a lot about this. People are like, I don't understand. Why are people buying records? Don't they like Spotify? It's like, no, they like both. I have a Spotify account, pro account. I pay for it. And I also have, you know, 1,000 records, and some stuff I like to listen to on records, some stuff I like to listen to on Spotify. And hey, when I'm out in the car walking, I'm not bringing a turntable with me. I want both. I work with a computer and I write on a computer, but hey, look, I write down dumb things on pieces of paper. I could show you tons of paper that I use for other purposes. We want that balance. And e-commerce is a great example. You know, the Mark Andreessen, the famous venture capitalist, said, you know, e-commerce is going to eat the lunch of brick and mortar retail. There will be no brick and mortar in, you know, 10 years or whatever. He said this over 10 years ago. And there were all these predictions at the beginning of the pandemic when everybody was clicking to buy their groceries online and ordering stuff from Amazon. Like, this is it. This is the end of brick and mortar retail. Stores are dead. You know, e-commerce is growing and we're leaping forward, and this is the new normal. We're never going back. And as soon as those stores could reopen, people flooded to them, and e-commerce has taken a dive. Amazon's stock, Amazon's e-commerce sales are way down. Shopify's are way down across the board, because at the end of the day, yeah, I like to buy certain things online because I need them specifically, or I have to find the right thing. I had to order a fuse for my microwave because it broke a few weeks ago. I'm not going to go around to 30 stores to find a GE Spacemaker XL 1800 fuse. I'm going to be like, GE Spacemaker XL 100 fuse. Here we go. Watch the YouTube video. Did it. I felt like a champion. Right. But if I want to go buy an avocado, I'm going to go squeeze 100 avocados till I find the right one.
You're really picky about your avocados. One of the things that you do also talk about is our personalities in digital versus analog, and how I think Jaron Lanier wrote, social media turns people into assholes. And it's only when we start to interact with one another face to face that we maybe lose that tendency to move into assholery, if that's a word. How important is that today? And is that kind of one of the primary takeaways you hope people get from the book, that look, interact with people in person and maybe there'll be less assholes in the world?
Yes. Today, November 9th, the day after the US midterms, in, a week or so after Elon Musk took over Twitter, I would say it's a pretty poignant example. Look, the thing we craved the most, whether it was school or work or, our cultural communities, our religious communities, during the sort of height of the pandemic, was conversations face to face in rooms with other people. There simply was no substitute for that. And I think we saw something change. We felt something change in our lives, and we couldn't quite put our finger on it. And certainly, if we were spending more time on social media, I don't think anyone ever spends more time on social media and feels better about it. That's just the truth, right? There's so much research on what social media does to us as social creatures and human beings, and very little of it is positive.
Yeah, you have an interesting way of talking about it in the book. You say that the promise of the metaverse is a cowardly future. And if we hide away from real life, it's like, what's the point? Which is so true when you think about it.
Now, in hindsight, a year later, as Facebook stock is crashing and they just announced, 12,000 layoffs or something today because nobody's going on to this metaverse thing we created, it seems obvious. But a year ago when it was announced, people were like, what's our corporate metaverse strategy? Nobody blinked when Mark Zuckerberg was like, this is the future we're going to. You and I are going to be sitting and having this discussion in a room, but you'll be a hologram and I'll be a hologram, but it'll feel like we're there. And at the time, people were like, this is Mark Zuckerberg. He created Facebook. He knows everything. Do you know anyone who actually wants that future? Do any of your friends or relatives sit there all day with a screen strapped to their eyes, like 3 inches away from their eyeballs, and being like, this is it. Oh my God, I can't wait to live like this for the rest of my life. Right? I don't know anyone who does. I don't know anyone who even owns one of these headsets. And that's something. It's not that people are afraid to adopt it. It's not that people are Luddites. It's not that they're behind the times or clinging to some sort of, notion of analog superiority or inefficiency. It's like, we as human beings are corporeal creatures. We are biological beings. We're animals, and we live on this world, and we interact with this world with all 5 of our senses. And you saw when we were locked inside and we only had screens that we were mostly pretty damn miserable, right? So the idea that we're going to double down on that, and the issue with the past couple of years and, the misery that people felt, the burnout, the sense of alienation and social isolation that's driving people to horrible problems. Social isolation and loneliness is one of the most pervasive health problems across the world.
Yeah. That
the solution to that, rather than getting people out in the world having real conversations, rather than investing in things like schools and teachers and education, or cultural institutions like theaters, or cities where you build more spaces like parks and libraries where people can actually come in together. The solution to that is to do this.
Yeah, it's unnatural. And what I find interesting about the excitement around all of these digital tools and digital platforms is that it's kind of made a book like yours, where you talk about the future being analog, necessary. I wonder, though, what the reaction has been. Have people been like, oh yeah, you're totally right? Because everything you're saying to me sounds totally logical. Who would want to do that with their thing in front of them? their face, right? But there are people who feel threatened by this message, are there? Or people who just don't get it or don't agree? Or has everyone been like, yeah, totally, thank God you wrote this, because that was already what I was thinking?
First of all, you know, this book is a statement, and it's an argument. And so, yeah, people are not universally in agreement, nor should they be. I have found the reactions somewhat binary in that way. People are either like you, they're like, yes, this, I totally get it, I felt the same way. Or others who their argument isn't, nope, I loved all that time I spent indoors, you're totally wrong. But it's like, they tend to be very invested in the notion of digital as the sort of central force of the future. And they say it's not a question of digital or analog. Digital is going to be there, and it's going to be the most important thing. We just didn't get it right last time. The teachers weren't trained enough, right? We didn't have enough time to implement it. We didn't, you know, it wasn't the right technology yet. And as soon as we pass a certain nouveau Turing test of whatever technology it is, then the brave new world, the bright new future will be there. You know, just, you know, once Oculus 5 comes along, then you're not going to say no to this. No, it's going to be right. And I get it. There's financial reasons. If you work for a company like Facebook, you know, when people are like, hey, social media is cancer, it's poison, it's, you know, there's a number, here's 5 genocides that are directly related to it. You know, you want to defend what you're doing, because not only is it your livelihood, your money, and your employment, it's
Your
like
identity.
It's your identity. It's the thing
Yeah.
you've built. You have built yourself around this mission. And all these things started out as these very hopeful, altruistic visions of the future, right? You know, every Kickstarter video, every TED Talk, every, you know, pitch day, demo day of a startup or a company, it's like, this thing is gonna, quote unquote, change the world, right? We're gonna make everything better once we introduce this new software. And hey, everyone's going to be talking. And there's very little thought to these sort of unforeseen consequences or potentially negative outcomes, right? It tends to be very utopian in that view. And so something that challenges that is very challenging, not only to people's, you know, economic identity, but again, that entire utopian idealism that the Silicon Valley sort of ethos and the world of digital technology has really been built around. And I think a more balanced approach that injects a little skepticism into things and actually asks the harder questions and engages in critical thinking about what kind of future do we want, because there's 2 truths going into the future. Okay. One is that there is going to be all sorts of incredible, wonderful, powerful, pervasive new digital technologies and new technologies that are going to come out. Someone is inventing the next great social network or whatever it is, the next VR headset, the next, you know, AI application or big data application.
Constantly.
And those are going to be, you know, incredibly powerful, incredibly pervasive, incredibly lucrative if you're an investor. And that's going to continue on and on until the future, until we're zipping around on spaceships, each of our own spaceships, obviously. But here's the other thing, is that we're still going to be human, right?
Yeah.
As much as Ray Kurzweil wants us to believe that we're going to upload our brains to the matrix once the singularity comes and just live in a computer and be these digital gods, we're still going to have these bodies. What is the future that we fit into in that, even with technology? I think that's a healthy way. That's a mature way to move forward, rather than saying, hey, we all have to adopt this new thing because it's the future. And if you don't do it, you're left behind. Not even a year ago, right? Not even 1 year ago, were we all inundated with commercials for cryptocurrency trading platforms. And every one of these was like, you better get on board, you dumbass Luddites.
You're missing out. You're missing the whole thing. What's their tagline? Have fun staying poor.
Ooh, the Schadenfreude. It is particularly delicious now, isn't it? How's that Lambo, bro? Still driving that Lambo? No? Oh, you upgraded to a bicycle. that
Yeah,
you
right.
borrowed from your parents.
The world is filled with examples like that. And I think your book is a great reminder of things that I think many people know, but it's really important. And so I just want to say thank you for writing this amazing book. We have been talking to David Sax. The book is called The Future is Analog, and it is available right now. I want to thank you for joining me on the Non-Obvious Book Review.
Thank you.